の3サイズはほにょほにょほにょほにょ。
なんでわかるの?
Well, what did you expect when you decided to work for Toei? Privacy?
So last time when we talked about the numbers 1 and 6 of certain superhero teams, we mostly ended up focusing on characters who had significant rivalries with one another before and kind of after their face turns. I mean, it only makes sense. The first proper 6 Ranger had one of the most timeless of rivalries, the sibling. Super Sentai would try to change it up a little, and while it did have varying degrees of success, as I already said, I would say for the most part they have gone beyond just the rival trope. Same can kinda be said for Precure. I mean, while Hikaru would never dream of becoming a rival character, whether you consider the next 6 Rangers to be the Kiryu sisters or Kurumi, they did fall into the rival category for the lead. Also, apparently the term for Precure 6 Rangers is supposed to be mid-season cures.
Honestly, we still have a lot of shows to go through, so it's easier just to use a blanket term like 6 Ranger.
The point is that while rival 6 Rangers will always be a thing, as it is a very flexible trope to build new characters off of, I also do think both franchises needed to expand beyond just the most common of shonen tropes. Thus, for this video, we want to take a look at some of the lead and 6 Ranger relationships that aren't entirely just made up of rivalries.
I mean, again, rivalries will almost assuredly always be there, but I just want to take a look at a few more types before we combine them all together and see if we can form a good example of a 6 Ranger and a not so good example. Oh boy.
Whenever a new character is introduced in any show, not just Japanese media, they're often introduced with a little something called the Worf Effect. The term was coined from the Star Trek Next Generation character, who at first was a legit badass Klingon warrior who couldn't easily be defeated in hand-to-hand combat. Thus, when they needed to introduce a new threat that couldn't be beat by conventional means, they would have them defeat Worf again, and again, and again.
Yeah, unfortunately for that dude, he became a total jobber.
Also, the concept itself likely existed even before Star Trek. For example, when Lil Jon beat Robin Hood during their first encounter, but the point, however, almost inevitably, the new character will also become the victim of this same effect, so the creators don't want to overdo it to the point that it becomes repetitive and makes a ton of the cast feel like a bunch of losers.
Hi, Dragon Ball!
One way of softening the blow is by establishing that they have some sort of significant advantage over the other characters. Going back to Robin Hood, in some of the early ballads, Lil Jon was established as being not that little at about 7 feet tall, as well as being a formerly trained monk. For the 6 Ranger, their greater strength could be justified through objectively better equipment and or more experience. With the latter, they sometimes take it to the logical extreme and have them be a vet of some previous conflict. This leads into the first different relationship for the first and 6, the student and the master.
So last time, we ended on a couple of works of one of my personal favorite writers, Atsushi Maekawa.
Specifically Digimon 02 and Fresh Precure. However, in between those two anime, he also wrote a bunch of Super Sentai. In particular, he was the head writer of one of my personal favorites. On a bit of a side note, for that series, they had a 6 Ranger, as well as what could be classified as 2 extra Rangers. Basically, heroes who are significantly removed from the normal rotation of the core team. For Precure, that's where you could say characters like the Kiryus and Pecori fall into. For Magiranger, since the original 5 were siblings of a mage family, the extra Rangers were actually their parents, so yeah, I don't think their toys would have sold all that well.
I mean, not unless you actually want to invite mom and dad into your role-playing, but yeah, let's just move on.
Anyway, the actual 6 Ranger of the team was Magishine, aka Hikaru's sensei. Yep, after he was introduced, he began instructing the Rangers in the ways of magic, as he was a holy spirit that had been taught magic by their father, and was now passing on his teachings to his mentor's kids. It led to him having an interesting dynamic with the heroes, and of course justified being way stronger as well as having the much cooler costume. Seriously, this is one of my favorite designs in all of Sentai.
That said, overall, Sensei was just an okay 6th.
I mean, he was perfectly likable, I'm sure, especially to certain demographics, but he did have a huge arc, at least compared to the previous Sentai we've talked about. Still, he did have a significant one, realizing that a teacher can learn just as much from their students. One of my favorite episodes, in fact, was him learning from the green of the team the importance of family bonds that were almost destroyed by the monster of the week.
Seriously, of all the things they almost directly adapted for Mystic Force, including Hikaru, why didn't they include more of these family themes? They're just so good.
Though for our discussion, we have to talk about his most significant lesson, which of course came from the red of the team, Kai. We actually did mention this a little in a previous video where we discussed great Toei leads, but basically he learned that sometimes impulsive proactiveness can be just as, if not more important than planning everything out ahead of time, especially when you're on a time crunch. Don't be afraid of failure, as sometimes things can just work out with a little stubborn effort. It highlighted the show's theme of courage well, and effectively showed growth in both characters. And even though the first and Sixth Ranger dynamic here wasn't a major story element of this show, they still portrayed a fairly unique relationship all the same.
Also, there's a lot of other good things to enjoy about Magiranger. Seriously, go check it out. It's a really underrated series.
Anyway, back on the Precure side, they also tackled a similar dynamic for the next series, After Fresh, and made it much more a focal point. In fact, you could argue it was one of the main arcs of that show. Heartcatch Precure would end up being the first series to introduce 2 new members, at least not simultaneously, and while Itsuki is a perfectly fine character in her own right, she didn't have much of a relationship with the lead Tsubomi, other than exposing that she was
Gay!
But yeah, the real show stealer was Yuri Tsukage, who was very well built up as the battle-hardened vet, down to her VA even being the original Sailor Mercury. Thus, even before she formally joined the team, they were learning a lot from her, especially Tsubomi, who had seen visions of her past and had come to really admire her.
Am I the only one who finds it kind of cute that these two are mother and daughter in another reality?
And through her, they ended up learning the most difficult lesson that comes from being a warrior of justice, the fatal risk and consequences they involve. For her, she had experienced the worst kind of fallout for any soldier in a war, losing a close friend and ally with the rather graphic death of a fairy partner that I don't think they have or ever will try to top.
Yeah, to this day, I am amazed at how little this season pulled its punches, especially in comparison to some of the more modern ones, but we'll get to one of them in just a bit.
Still, because of it, she ended up taking on the role of the strict instructor, even initially discouraging Tsubomi and Erika from continuing their work. However, while she did initially want them to quit, as the conflict with the Desert Apostles escalated, she had to relent that not only did they need to continue the fight, but she needed to rejoin it in spite of her past traumas. And her final decision to rejoin the fight was spurred on by the Heartcatch team, in particular one of her biggest simps, fans, Tsubomi, encouraging her with the big theme of this show, change, which, while in the literal sense just meant changing her clothes, it also meant starting anew and being reborn and all that jazz. And while she didn't forget the pain of her past, as should be the case, she learned how to move on from it.
The past can't hurt. You can either run from it or learn from it.
From there, she was, again, justifiably much stronger than the rest of the team based on pure experience to almost game-breaking levels. Fortunately, they were at least in the final quarter of their series, so there wasn't many issues with the power scaling, and there wasn't that much spotlight left to steal from the rest of the team.
Besides, it's not as though there was nothing else that she couldn't learn from a certain someone.
While Tsubomi had admired and modeled much of her Precure career after Yuri, not only did she play a big part in breaking her out of retirement, but she was also breaking out into her own superheroine. One who in some ways you could argue had already surpassed the mentor. And after the magical girl in purple suffered again from losing someone close to her before it was a meme, Yuri understandably wanted to go to town on Dune for being the cause of everything wrong in her life. However, Tsubomi stopped her, both to save her friend from doing something that she might regret, and to preserve her image of the idol cure she had held to. This was in spite of the fact that by the end of the series, she had seen many cracks in her idealized image of a Precure that was Yuri. From the aforementioned attempts to get them to quit, to needing to beat Josh back into action, she just wasn't exactly the best role model for much of the series. And yet, because Tsubomi was an optimist and needed that paragon to drive changes in her own life, she kept believing that Cure Moonlight would return, and she eventually did. And when that paragon was seemingly going to be destroyed again, this time by Yuri's own hands, she reminded her of the ideals of the superheroines they both followed.
While Heartcatch is often remembered for some of its darker elements, I think it should also be appreciated for some of the stronger themes that were the centerpiece of the arc of these two.
In spite of Yuri being everything she wanted to be, Tsubomi managed to carve her own path towards her own ideals of heroism. In turn, Yuri managed to get back on the path she had fallen from. It was a strong, symbiotic relationship that made both characters better, in particular Yuri, in spite of her limited role in the show overall.
Though speaking of symbiotic relationships, some of the commenters did bring up a good point of there being another sort of kind of Sixth Ranger that could be found in the third of the trinity that we usually cover, Kamen Rider.
While there have been surprisingly a lot of Rider seasons where they've even gone past the number 6, and Riders often switch between protagonists and antagonists at the drop of a hat, for our purposes, I want to focus on a main secondary Rider. The Nigo, or number 2 to the Ichigo, or number 1, which in the case of the OG series was more of necessity, as the titular character's actor had gotten into a bike accident and they needed a temp who eventually settled in as his partner. Regardless, you still could consider Nigo, and later Riderman for V3, to have been mid-season new heroes like a Sixth Ranger. In the case of the latter, he even started off as an antagonist.
This concept would be further elaborated on during the Heisei era, where many secondary riders, like my personal favorite, Chalice, were treated like the Deuteragonist of their respective shows. And yeah, I know Gun is kind of considered to be the real secondary, but come on, it was totally Chalice.
But I think we've memed enough on poor Hajime, so instead, let's take a look at a series that'll become a little more relevant later. Kamen Rider Kabuto was the 7-rider series of the Heisei era and was written by Shoji Yonemura and Toshiki Inoue. The former, ironically enough, also wrote Smile Precure, one of the few series that doesn't have a Sixth Ranger. Movie cures don't count. Meanwhile, the latter writer will again be more relevant later, so just remember this name.
But yeah, this show is one that I'm often very torn about.
I mean, in general, I can confidently say it's not a good series due to an inconsistent tone and plot holes up the wazoo. Granted, not all of it was this show's fault, as one of their main actresses was going through some personal issues during production, and there were scheduling conflicts with another major supporting character. Regardless though, I think I still would have had issues with the supposed main character, the titular Kabuto, aka Soji Tendo.
Now, I can totally understand why people like this character. I mean, I for one am going to totally admit that his actor, Hiro Mizushima, is charismatic as all hell.
彼が stronger なら俺は strongest.
However...
俺の下につけ。何？当然だろ。
This guy is one of the main reasons I don't consider Mana Aida to be a Mary Sue, because this is a Mary or Gary Stu in this case. He goes through very little character growth, is seldom challenged, and when he is, he just Deus Ex Machinas that crap, and all around is just not that much of an interesting character other than for certain memes that again we'll get to later. The point is that for the longest time, I was not a fan of Kabuto, but as of late, I have gained more appreciation for it, both because of the meme collecting, and for the main quote-unquote secondary writer of the show, Gatak, aka Arata Kagami.
And yes, I'm using the biggest quotation marks possible, because frankly, he is written more like the main character of the show, and in some ways you could view it from that perspective throughout the entire series.
It certainly wouldn't be the first time fans had made such mental corrections, and if anything, it does at least highlight one of the truly great elements of the show, the rivalry/friendship between the two Beetle Riders. Now the two really did not start off on the right foot, with Tendo seemingly stealing Kagami's first chance at becoming a superhero. And yet, he still remained a consummate professional and tried to get the guy to join the organization he worked for, but was turned down at every turn. Thus, more than just becoming another rival relationship, which they certainly were at times, Kagami did want to become an actual friend and ally with this dude, who seemed like he was trying to be an angsty little lone wolf.
Watching it specifically for the blooming relationship between the two writers does make it a lot more palatable. I mean, I still don't think it saves the show, especially from these Hot Topic rejects, but it does make it a lot better.
However, in his own very putsy way, Tendo did show that he did at least care about Kagami and did save him on more than one occasion. Hell, it was heavily hinted that some of Tendo's hostility was to discourage him from becoming a rider for his own safety, as at least the beginning of the series, Kagami was being a naive tool in every sense of the word, with him not even questioning some of the shady dealings of the organization that he worked for, that even had a whole team called Shadow. He eventually seemed to pick up on this, and as a result, rejected his initial rider persona of the Bee when they ordered him to exterminate Tendo. He would later build up the resolve when confronted with the ghosts of his past, and acquired both the Gatak Zector as well as the silent approval of Kabuto, acknowledging he was ready. It was very subtle, yet well-told storytelling, and by the end, the two had seemed to form a believable friendship, if not arguably much sooner than even that. As a result, amongst some of the more perplexing character arcs throughout the series, the relationship between these two remained the most consistent, and what kept my attention the most through a rewatch. It highlights some very subtle, almost missable development for the title character, which I'll take over none, and also really showed a great character arc in Kagami. On a bit of a side note, it does really help to view him as the actual main protagonist, as while he didn't become a writer immediately, he did also receive consistent focus, and in an episode of another series, Jiro, which was a big crossover season, he did finally become Kabuto like he always wanted. Regardless, red, blue, Heracross, or Pincer, this show's otherwise inconsistent writing benefited greatly from the friendship, or really bromance, between these two. Meanwhile, Sentai would continue with some of their usual tropes, like the loner or the rival, who even served as the main villain for most of his series. Yeah, Trent and Mikoto were very different characters. Likewise, with the Precure, we would get not one, but two, maybe three more brainwashed Six Rangers, but more on them later. As during the same year we got one of my favorite Precure series, we also got one of my favorite Sentai of all time, and another example of the friendly Six Ranger. Samurai Sentai Shinkenger was the 33rd series of the franchise, and was about a team forming around a red named Takeru, who was like a modern-day shogunate to them.
Now, putting aside how they totally butchered this character for PR, I mean seriously, how could you not include this face? Genta in general was just a fun character, and one of the best bros ever.
Being childhood friends with Takeru, he treated him a little different than people he had met much later in life and had been assigned as his retainers, being far more chummy. Ironically though, this initially led to his old friend rejecting his attempts of joining the team. Part of the reason for this was that he was afraid he'd end up opening more to the rest of his team because of this goofball, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened. As he got deeper in with the team and associated with all of its members, Genta in turn forced Takeru to admit that he was growing to care about them beyond just being his vassals. Obviously, this was a good thing, especially in the long term, but for Takeru, it was the last thing he ever wanted, especially when he initially formed the team. Because as it turned out, the young lord wasn't exactly who he said he was. In actuality, he wasn't even part of the main lineage of the shogun. He was simply meant to stand in for the actual heiress, Karu, until she was ready to join the fight and relieve him of duty. This was kept a secret from the rest of the team in order to maintain the act, but it was also constantly eating away at Takeru, knowing that he was lying to them and forcing them to worship a false idol. In Genta's case, though,
and really, Takeru probably knew that was going to be the response he'd get from his old friend, so that wasn't really the issue. The real issue was how he didn't want to show a different side of himself to his old friend.
True friends never want to show off their weakest selves, both for their own pride, as well as not wanting to drag down others with them. However, as I kind of said, it all ended up working out for the better, as not only did the rest of the team remain loyal to Takeru thanks to Genta's pleas, his infectious energy even managed to spread to the other red of the team, and get the emotionally distant Karu to open up a little more. This even resulted in Takeru being reinstated as the next heir after her thanks to an insane loophole.
And while I could totally understand his personality grating on some, I also don't think the bromance factor of the Sushi Samurai should ever be discounted.
By just being a good Six Ranger friend to two Reds, he in many ways ended up becoming the main factor to their final victory. Thus, I think he more than earned this. back to the magical girls, as I said, we got 3 more brainwash cures, and since we've already talked about them a lot in the past, we'll just quickly run through them here. Siren, aka Ellen Kurokawa, was a fun cure, and while she didn't have a strong relationship with the pink lead Hibiki, her brainwashing was handled competently, if a little cliched, showing just how much she regretted allowing herself to be manipulated by the villains just because of a little envy towards her old friend. That said, Toa Akagi definitely had the superior arc in my opinion. Like Ellen, she did become a victim of her own poor choices, being the princess who wandered right into the witch's lair, but as a result, not only was she abducted for a much longer time from childhood to her teens, but her disappearance also led to the downfall of her whole kingdom. A bit of a contrived downfall, but still. Moreover, her relationship with her pink lead, Haruka, was far more meaningful than Ellen's with Hibiki. Hell, even as the villainess Twilight, she unintentionally got her into violin playing, which both improved her everyday skills and gave her a greater appreciation for the work that goes into being a princess. In fact, ironically, some of her machinations as a villainess might have arguably been some of the strongest motivations she needed to become a true princess, along with some of her brother's motivations. A few seasons later, we would get Ruru, though in her case, her brainwashing was programming, though in a much more literal sense than even Setsuna's. And until she met Emu and the show started to revolve around the two, she was an interesting character, struggling as an android, trying to understand the ways of the human, thanks to her interactions with Hana. There wasn't a great follow-up after her initial arc because that's Hakuto in a nutshell, but still, the character was fine, if misused a lot.
Overall, though, I would say Toa might be my second favorite Sixth Ranger of the Precure franchise, though recently that position has been challenged.
To wrap up this discussion about friendly Six Rangers that may or may not have had certain undertones to them, let's talk about one girl and her big goldfish. Tropical Rouge Precure was the 38th series in the franchise and had a plot that was kind of all over the place. Granted, that was kind of part of its charm, even if it did lead to a very messy file arc, but you can watch some other videos to learn more about that, hint hint. Besides, at least it didn't take away that much from these two, as in spite of not becoming a Precure until that good old episode 17, Laura was introduced in the very first episode, and had essentially become the deuterogonist of the show to Manatsu's main protagonist. Their relationship was your classic odd couple with the straight man and the living embodiment of caffeine. Thus, they went through all of the usual tropes that we've already discussed in this video, but still, they were fairly unique because 1, they did get a lot closer than those other examples.
Just already!
And 2, they did have a very interesting backstory that we'll get to in just a minute. Regardless, the effects both characters had on the other were quite apparent. Manatsu thankfully took it down a few octaves and was able to do what her dad said and actually focus on what was important rather than trying to find every important thing she could. It improved her grades and led her to becoming more attentive to the rest of her team.
Meanwhile, not only did Laura become a little less haughty, but she also managed to overcome some of her more bigoted views.
Yeah, there's no getting around it. Laura was a bit of a racist towards humans at the beginning of the series, believing that the ocean, which does cover most of the planet, was superior. And yet, as she learned more about the land, mostly through Manatsu, she not only began to appreciate all it had to offer, but also started to become envious of those who could freely traverse it. From there, she came to realize how truly close-minded some of her views were, and had to admit to herself that she wanted to walk alongside her friends.
While I still do have my issues with her becoming a cure, I also won't deny that her gaining legs was an important first step in fleshing out her character, as well as her relationship with Manatsu.
As a result, the two got even closer to the point you'd almost think they've known each other for years.
Yeah, about that.
As it would turn out, one of this team's greatest adversaries wouldn't be on the villain side, but rather from within. At the tail end of the series, it was revealed that the two girls had actually met long before the first episode and became quick friends. However, those memories were just as quickly erased when the Queen of the Grand Ocean found out that the two species had made contact. She was of the belief that because of their extended lifespans that would far outlast the average human, her people would be better off not bearing the burden of eternal loss. This was kind of obviously a very wrong thing to do to a little girl, especially considering how it led to Manatsu developing trauma over not properly introducing herself to a new friend before seemingly never being able to see her again, and it also kind of resulted in Laura becoming a bigot. After all, why would she hold any respect to another world if she was never allowed to even have memories of it? The only thing she could hold towards the surface world were biases and prejudices that were being perpetuated by a factious monarch who tried to force her people to live in seclusion based solely off of her own bad experiences and failures and
yeah, I know I keep asking this, but why wasn't the Queen the final boss of the show? She was essentially a Xenoblade antagonist in Precure of all things.
I mean, really looking back on it, I think I might have to revise my old overview of this show. Most of my opinions would still remain the same, like how they really fumbled the final arc, especially in regards to the memory machine, but I might rethink saying that Yuriko and Asuka had the best character-driven plotline, as this lead and six pairing had one of the more unique relationships of the whole franchise. One dealing with a forgotten friendship that, in spite of years apart and program bias, so maybe we should also consider Laura brainwashed 6, was able to be reforged thanks to Manatsu's earnestness and Laura's stubborn determination. I will definitely still say that Tropical Rouge was a heavily flawed series, but I will also say that the story of the tropical obsessed girl and her forgotten fish waifu at least elevated to an enjoyably flawed series for me.
Thus, going into the next series, I was looking forward to what they could bring for the Six Rangers, and while Sentai for the most part has lived up to expectations, I can't exactly say the same about Precure.
Yep, it's finally time for the main event of these videos, where we'll take a look at the time of this recording, the two currently airing Toei properties, Avataro Sentai Donbrothers and Delicious Party Precure, to examine how they handled their six rangers and their relationships with their respective leads. Honestly, I wanted to run through the many different variations of these relationships, both for the runtime, as well so that we'd have a basis to compare and contrast Amane Kasai versus Jiro Momotani. One kind of neatly blends together a lot of different elements of the Six Ranger trope together, while the other doesn't do much of anything, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, since we are reviewing it weekly, I don't think we have to give a rundown on what Delicious Party is, but we should probably introduce Donbrothers and my general thoughts about it as of the time of this recording.
Though, interestingly enough, these two shows did share a bit of a spiritual kinship thanks to a certain writer and another show we actually covered in this very video.
Toshiki Inoue is a very important screenplay writer for Tokusatsu. He has series comped one of the most revered Sentai, Jetman, and like with Kabuto, Secondary wrote a ton of Kamen writers like Kuga, Ryuki, and Blade. Though, unlike his co-writer Shoji Yonemura, he hasn't written for Precure, and that's probably for the best.
Craziest thing is that I've actually heard people compare him with Yoshimi Narita, the head writer of Splash Star and Happiness Charge.
Which, if we're talking about how prolific they are, then yes, objectively that is true. Though if we're talking about their writing styles, well, both do put an emphasis on comedy, though in Inoue's case, I would say his material gets a little distracting at times, especially when mixed in with all of his other little writing quirks that tend to lean his shows more in the general area of Sin City. Yeah, in the Tokusatsu community, they compare him a lot with Frank Miller for how edgy he can get, as well as how he treats his female characters, which I won't use the S word for either writer, but I will ask, did you really have to kill off Kamen Femme like that? Like, seriously, brah? Still, the long, convoluted point I'm trying to make is that I went to Donbrothers not knowing what to expect, and considering this was the first Sentai he was series comping since the aforementioned Jetman,
I was honestly expecting the worst, but so far, along with Kira Major, this has been one of the best Sentai I've seen in recent years.
I might actually do my first full Sentai review for this series on the channel, but for now, I'll say I've been really enjoying the show, awful CGI and all. But to just give a quick sum up of why I like it, I think it's a season that handles characterizations and development really damn well. Now, one of the more noticeable aspects of Inoue's writing is that he tends to make a lot of his characters, especially the mains, kind of jerks. And as I've said in the past, I like this setup where you take a very flawed character and develop them into a much better person, which thanks to the show's great pacing, allows for multiple characters to develop in a single episode. One of the best examples of this is of course the red lead Taro Momoe, aka Don Momotaro, who in many ways does remind me of a certain other red dude. Being the living representation of the Japanese folklore hero of the same name, he was able to excel at almost everything. He does his day job great, can cook, clean, and is often the MVP of many battles.
So you'd almost expect him to become a Gary Stu like Tendo, but that's not exactly the case.
Instead, the story presents him in a very self-aware Gary Stu or parody Stu sort of way. His perfection actually becomes the basis for a lot of comedy, with characters getting annoyed at how much he butts into their business, as well as his brutal honesty, which also ended up alienating him from everyone else as a kid and into adulthood.
If I were to describe him to a Precure fan, I think I would say he's kind of like Mana Aida, except taken up to 11, and with a lot more flaws that are thankfully pointed out.
This will especially come to a head once we reach the 6th Ranger arc, which interestingly enough started off with...
I'm sorry, what?
Yep, Taro was seemingly killed off after one of the antagonists took advantage of his perfectionist tendencies, of which he was physically incapable of lying, including when asked if he had any specific weaknesses in battle, and yeah.
I did not think that through!
As a result, it seemed like they would need a new leader. Enter Jiro Momotani, aka Don Drogoku. While Taro represented the Japanese folklore hero Momotaro, Jiro represented the Chinese hero Sun Wukong. As a result, the representations of the two great Asian heroes ended up paralleling each other a lot, whilst also contrasting each other in key areas. For instance, and much like Tendo, Taro did want to improve his team's abilities through some very abrasive tough love. Meanwhile, Jiro seemed like he tried to work well with his new team at first, but...
僕考えたんですけど、皆さんを処刑しようかなって。
And to think, this was even before the other guys showed up.
But yeah, much like Naoto from Time Ranger, he did try, and even kind of succeeded at being the temporary leader of the Donbrothers in Taro's absence, and under his lead, he almost killed off 2 of his teammates when they proved to be liabilities. For Jiro, he prioritized some very survival of the fittest beliefs versus Taro's Spartan mindset. Both are obviously very flawed heroic philosophies that both men started to realize, especially Jiro, who ironically was originally inspired to become a superhero thanks to Taro. Thus, they decide to rescue him through some very complicated methods. Again, I might review this series later on, so we'll save it until then. The point was that Taro was back, and now they could work together with a bit of a mentor and student relationship, though kind of reversed in this situation.
However, if you know the Monkey King, then you know he was a bit of a wild card in his stories, so of course Jiro lived up to that. By the way, could you tell that was actually Romy Park saying all that?
After being denied the position of Taro's successor, the once tranquil dragon became the vicious tiger. For Jiro, the Donbrothers had become an obstacle towards his path of gaining acknowledgement as a true hero, which really was more glory hounding than anything else, so a part of him really wanted to get rid of them, and thus a split personality named Dangerous Jiro was born.
So yeah, now they had an evil 6th Ranger, which yeah, we have seen a lot of.
But wait! There's more!
Oh good god, this show.
For so far unexplained reasons, Dangerous Jiro became a quite literal split personality, which at least had the benefit that they could strengthen their numbers and even form an additional mech because of him. Moreover, as silly as all this is, it also did lead to some interesting developments for all sides. Jiro was able to literally confront his inner demons, get off your vice, with Dangerous Jiro reminding him of his ambitions and pointing out how his hero worship of Taro was legit unhealthy. This seems to be putting him on the track for an arc where the two sides will compromise on what a truly ideal hero is. One who could be selfless like Taro, but also have his own ambitions. Meanwhile, Taro has gone through a lot of character development, really thanks to most of his team, though Jiro was a significant wake-up call. He made him realize they can't be so standoffish when mentoring his team, dangerous eccentricities and all. At times, their interactions really do feel like Tendo and Kagami 2.0, while also playing some other standby Sentai tropes. And it really just goes to show that Inoue has been working on tokusatsu for a long time and can both satirize the genre while taking full advantage of its tropes.
Too bad I can't really say the same about its time slot neighbor.
If you've been watching my weekly reviews of Delicious Party, then you'll know how much I didn't care for the Gentle/Amane arc. Even putting aside some of the major contrivances like Detective Yuri putting together, Genta wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I mean, what's wrong with trapping some girls in a storage locker that normally you need the jaws of life to get open? It just didn't have any of the intrigue or engaging elements of similar arcs. I mean, okay, so they decided to go with brainwashed antagonists for their 6. Alright, it's more than a little played out, but I was willing to hear them out if they did something interesting, like maybe give an intriguing reason why she joined the villains, like Siren doing it out of envy. Well, as of the time of this recording, we still haven't gotten any confirmation on how she even met the bundles. I think Narcissus might have brainwashed her, but nothing much other than that, and now that we're this far removed from that initial arc, any reveals now will have far less impact.
But okay, maybe they'll give her an interesting little redemption arc like Toa's, while she'll try and make up for all the sins she had committed.
Well, first of all, she needed to commit some actual sins, and again, even if I thought it was contrived, the show established that she was literally gentle with her attacks and purposely tried to reduce casualties, so just going by their own established rules, she's not really guilty of much other than capturing the food fairies. Now, if they had actually referenced this more, and some of the restaurants she seemingly closed because of this might have had some good drama to it, but they never really did, so ultimately this does ring a little hollow.
But okay, forget about all of that. What about her relationship with the pink lead of her show, Yuri?
After all, that's what we've been focusing on throughout these videos, and hey, they even seem to be going with the classic rivalry like that of Love and Setsuna. So, was it any good, and did it develop both characters in a meaningful way?
No, not really, no.
As I said, they didn't reveal Amane's backstory yet, and therefore there wasn't much to do with her, especially when most of her scenes were the Amane and Gentle personality struggling with one another, which basically were all the same bit of,
I apologize, sometimes my other personality interrupts me. No, I don't. Shut up, whore!
Meanwhile, Yui was, well, I think it's pretty telling when fans are actually celebrating that she's seemingly gonna get her first full-on Spotlight episode, 30 episodes since the premiere of the series. I mean, okay, even if she hadn't gotten a lot of focus, they still could have played her off like a Tendo character, with almost everyone else being more interesting, and the blue person arguably being the real main, which they even seem to be leaning into at times with all the pointing at granny quotes. And yet, because she is strongly tied with the main plot involving Cook Kingdom, Takumi, and her fairy mascot being the special, they can't really go that route. Thus, the Gentle arc really should have built these two characters up through some sort of meaningful relationship, which they just didn't have. No old friendship because this was the first time they had met, and not even really a rivalry until like the very tail end. At times, it really does feel like the show wants to emulate some of those old tropes, but never seem like they're confident enough to commit to them or add anything new or interesting. Sure, nothing is truly new in fiction these days, but a good writer can still take those elements and add new twists to them.
And that's the fundamental difference I see between Delicious Party and Donbrothers: confidence and commitment.
With Donbrothers, I get the sense it's all being written by a veteran writer of the franchise who's combining elements of old shows, including some of his own work, and building off of them to make something new and fresh. Meanwhile, with Delicious Party, I get the sense other than Mutsumi Ito, everyone, including the head writer, is still relatively new to writing for this franchise, and even anime in general. Thus, they've been playing it overly safe so far, and haven't really done anything new or interesting with the tropes of the past, other than superficially referencing them. Yeah, ironically, both of these shows end up kind of referencing Kamen Rider Kabuto directly or thematically. And putting aside the fact that one of these shows' writers actually co-wrote it, I'm not sure why Delicious Party keeps referencing it, as if to remind us of another show featuring some heavy emphasis on cooking that at least developed its lead a little better. Again, I'm not even a huge fan of Kabuto, but at least it tried to do something different, and succeeded in some areas like the relationship between Tendo and Kagami. As a result, the Six Ranger arcs of these shows are kind of emblematic of the writing quality of them so far. I'm actually interested in seeing where they take Jiro's character from here, and how he might influence Taro's arc, while Amane, I'm not only not interested, but I also think the writers aren't either, as they do now have to focus on elements that they've kind of neglected, and I doubt they'll even have that many more interactions with Yuri. Now, of course, my opinions could change later. So far, both series are about halfway through their runs. Inoue could still pull some of his usual antics that detracted me from some of his other works, and now that we're far removed from the website hacks, Delicious Party could start course correcting. Regardless though, I do wish they could have handled Amane's initial arc better in comparison. Whether it was the fault of the hack or not, I still think it was a massive missed opportunity, as while not every Six Ranger needs to be close to their leads, those arcs do tend to be some of the strongest of their respective shows, even going back to the very beginning of the trope. So here's just hoping, like Inoue redoing Kabuto's main duel for Donbrothers, Precure can learn from this and give us some more meaningful Six Ranger arcs next season. There are a lot of variations they can choose from, and they just need the proper execution next time.
Well, that was our lengthy little video essay talking about the many different types of Six Rangers and examples of them. Obviously, we did skip through a lot, as well as skim through a lot, so do feel free to leave your comments below about what you think are some great examples of some Six Ranger and their type. For now though, we really should get back to finishing up a certain other project before the end of the year, and then maybe we'll close it out with more Tokusatsu top lists or something, we'll see. And until then though, for now my friends, and sir, there is clearly a no Matsuri sign on this beach, please follow it.